Hi friends, it's Vicki here, and I'm going to talk to you about watercolor markers. I get lots of emails and questions about these beautiful little water brush pens full of dye-based ink that make great watercolor techniques. And I think doing a little video that gives you 5 ways to use them will be super helpful, and it will be the next step in this series of creating artful backgrounds and mixed media backgrounds that we will then at the end of the series put in to a junk journal that I'm going to teach you how to bind in the free class. So come and watch, and I'm going to run through 5 different ways to use Vicki Boutin watercolor markers, and then I'll catch you on the end. And if you have any questions, make sure to post them in the comments below. Thumbs up if you enjoy the video, and if you haven't already, make sure you subscribe to the channel. I've got lots of ideas coming your way. So here we go. Let's look at 5 ways to use watercolor markers. Watercolor markers. Are you ready? This is a Vicki Boutin set of watercolor markers. There are 12 water-soluble markers. So it is like a water brush filled with dye ink. So these are not pigment that washes off your hand. This little baby is for those people who love getting inky fingers. Vicki Boutin watercolors, 12 colors, and I'm going to show you a few tips and tricks for using these beautiful little magic markers. So the water markers, when you get them, come in this box, and it shows you the different colors. You have mint julep, blue Hawaiian, watermelon burst, juicy pear, crushed pineapple, orange slice, coral, macaroon, cotton candy, sugared strawberry, cherry tart, plum pudding, and blueberry pie. This is what they look like outside of the package. This is how I store them in my work area. So one of the tips, when you get one of these markers, and let's open the package up so I can show you. Let's pull out cherry tart. So when you get the markers, before you use them, you need to remove this yellow ring. This yellow ring has prevented the little piece from going inside the cartridge to then release the ink, so they aren't leaking, because they will start to drip inside your lid once you have them open. So you take that ring off, and then you put your cap back on and screw it all the way on, and now it is in the valve. So when you squeeze it, it says push. When you squeeze that, the ink will go up through the nylon brush tip. And these are nice little tips. I love this size, about a number 10, I'd say. There's all the rings. So I'm not gonna lie, the first time I used it, I was pressing and pressing and couldn't get any color out. So that is a golden nugget special tip to use the watercolor markers. So there's all the beautiful colors and one empty one. This is a water brush that's mixed in there. And let's show you a couple of fun things you can do using the watercolor markers. So the watercolor markers, when you use them, I think most people will have the urge to use it straight out of the crayon. I want to show you, I'm going to swatch these out so you get an idea of what the colors look like. So let's start with the red. So this is a cherry tart. So like I said, when you go to apply it, you would just squeeze that push button, and then that gives you an idea of the color. Tons of pigment in that, right, friends? And then let's go here with sugared strawberry. Again, tons of pigment. Let's go in with the coral. Oh, cotton candy. Okay. They're so pretty, vibrant, lots of pigment in there. And the coral macaroon. Okay. Orange slice. A little squeeze. You do not need much of this product. Go in here with the crushed pineapple, juicy pear, watermelon burst. I'm gonna run out of space. Got a little crazy here. And then we have mint julep. Oops, that was in the lid, so I just threw it at you. And then how about a little bit of blue Hawaiian? So pretty. That's mint mixing though with some of the mint julep drip there. This one is a pure pigment, blueberry pie, super dark. You do not need much. It's almost black when it first goes on. And then we have plum pudding, which I ran out of space, so let's just put it over here. So that is what the watercolor markers look like. Let's put them back in here. Straight out of the brush. I'm just going to take a paintbrush, and you will have rainbow colors on your hands. And I love it. So can we pull that pigment? Look what happens here. There is a ton of pigment in these watercolor markers, okay? And I'm using them on foundations paper, so it has, the pigment did soak into the background. So this is not how I would generally use them. I wouldn't put the color down and then add the water in. And I also wouldn't use them straight out of the watercolor marker, and I'll tell you why. Look how beautiful those are. These react very differently than, say, art crayons, because it is dye-based. And then plum pudding. Can't forget you, little guy over here at the side. Oops. So that is what the watercolor markers look like right out of the tube or brush. They're beautiful. We need to make some art with this, okay? So because this is going to go into my little junk journal book, let's just kind of make something. So just showing you, look at, they're beautiful pigments, okay? Just make a little bit of a mess, but it will be pretty art. So we'll set that aside to dry. But oh my goodness, look how beautiful that is. Don't want to make mud, so I want to watch where the pigment runs. And we'll set that aside to dry. And let's show you a couple other things you can do using the watercolor markers. So I have a stamped image here, and I'm going to show you, clean up my area a little bit. If I'm using the watercolor marker and I'm painting directly, there is a ton of pigment. So I just find it's wasteful. How I like to use these is to grab something that I can use as my mixing plate or palette. So I can just put a couple of colors down here, and you don't need much, like a drop. And I really want to show you how dark this one is. So the blueberry pie, right? So just put them down and make your own little palette and color from there. So one of the things we can do with these markers, is to color a stamped image. And I really want you to see how much pigment is in here and how far these crayons will go. These watercolor markers will go. You don't need a lot. So I find it's much easier to then load that and add that same color on with a paintbrush, because then it's going to go a lot farther, okay? Look how much pigment is in there. Now look at this one. This is blueberry pie. There is a ton of pigment in that one tiny drop of watercolor. So let's throw that on there. Throw a little bit of the crushed pineapple, start to make a really pretty green. It pushes the other pigment out. So we can do all of these pretty little painting techniques using the watercolor markers. Let it dry and I can fussy cut them. So there is one of the things that you can do is watercolor painting using the watercolor markers. So one of my favorite ways to use the watercolor markers is the kissing technique. And you know what I say? We kiss it like it's our frail grandma, not like it's the rock. And I'm going to show you what I mean. But this is the easiest way to make a quick watercolor background. And I want you to see again how much pigment is in these markers. So I'm just going to put a couple of drips down, and I'm going to show you using multiple colors instead of just one color. Or let's start with one, okay? And then I can show you, we can add. Look at all that pigment in this dye base product. So we want enough water so it won't look like a stamped image, but it'll look nice and washed like a watercolor. Oops, and then tip it off, but I'll pick that up. So look at, we can just deposit that with kissing it, curling your card, and depositing your pigment so it does not look like a forced stamped area. It needs to flow around like a watercolor. So look, now let's go in with two other colors and show you how this works. And I'm just going to keep it in this kind of blue greeny palette. So I'll put a little bit of Juicy Pear on here. And this is totally different than my art crayons. This pigment, because it's dye base instead of a pigment, will go on, and it's just a pretty wash. I put a little Juicy Pear on there, and let's go crazy with a little bit of Blueberry Pie. Remember, tons of pigment in that one. So I'll blend them separately on my card, and we'll tap them down. And this is going to show you one. Ooh, look how much pigment's on there, right? You only need a drip because this guy will take right over because there's so much color in that. And then let's go and kiss those colors. Oh my gosh, that's so pretty. Move that around. And I want to show you, you could go in here and add more water if you want to move this around a little bit, fill in some more areas. But I want you to see how these will react. Look at all that pigment down here. Let's lift some of it and bring it up to the top. So it's harder, right, when you are going in here with the color and depositing, because you're not sometimes sure where to put it. You don't want the brush marks in there. But look at how these move around when you put those the water in there. It's very water reactive. And then I can even take it and kiss it a little bit, because then it softens out any brush marks that I've put in there, so it looks very watercolory. And then look at, you can let that bleed down into it. These are beautiful watercolors. And I would normally let this just sit and dry. And I did not use watercolor paper. This is on my foundations paper. So I will put a link to the foundations paper in the description so you can see what this is all about. But this kind of background, and I might even kiss it because I want to show you another step with what we can do with this watercolor, these watercolor markers. So I want it to be spread out and filling in the areas. Okay. Now, if I want to build depth, I would just let this dry and go in there again with another application of the watercolor. So we're going to let this dry, and I'm going to show you another thing that you can do on or using the watercolor markers. In addition to making these pretty watercolor backgrounds, and if you want it darker, you just put more pigment and layer your pigment on. These watercolor markers are also water reactive. So if I go in here and I put a couple of drips of water on here, I can then lift that pigment off. So take a look at that, friends. Remember I said that it will lift some of that pigment. There is where we put those drips on there, and then I just wiped it with a paper towel and it picked the color up. So I grabbed a sheet of watercolor paper. So let's kiss a darker color so you can see it, some of the plum pudding. add some water. And I want you to see, we'll kiss that on just like we would, creating that loose watercolor effect. See? Oh, look at that too. This is a great way to add interest, right? Just load your paintbrush and put some taps on there. But we could kiss that color in here and look at the watercolor markers are actually really great on watercolor paper because it will just hold that medium differently than a flat paper would. So while it's wet, I can go in here, like I said, with the water, and it will then start to wick and push the pigment out. So can you see that? So that's another fun way to use the watercolor markers. You could put some water marking into your background and it will push the pigment around. So that's another way that you can use them, is watermarking in your watercolor. And now I want to show you, let's elevate it another time and show you a different thing that you can do with the watercolor markers. Another effect I can show you using the watercolor markers is like a reverse, I can't even speak, reverse watercolor marking. So let's go in with, again, we'll just grab this blueberry pie. I'm going to put a couple drops down. We're going to do a kissed technique on the background. You need pigment on here. If it's not very dark, you're not going to get much of an effect. So let's go on here, do the kissing technique, and then I'm going to show you something fun. So this needs to be somewhat dry before we do the next step. So I'm laying some pigment down, and then I'm going to dry this, wipe this off so I don't put my hand in it. I'm going to dry this, and I'm going to show you something magical using the stencil brush and stencil. So now this is dry, and I'm going to show you this. Look how pretty that is, by the way. I'm going to show you this really fun effect where we can lift the color out of the deposited watercolor. So I'm going to go ahead and just wet the end of my stencil brush, and then I'm going to lay the stencil on top, and then I can just start to move that around on the watercolor and take some of that pigment out. So I'm not moving more pigment around. A little bit more water. And I can make this really fun effect in my watercolor background. Now, I don't want to rub too much because I will start to peel the paper, but look how fun that is, friends. Look at that effect. Isn't that beautiful? There's different ways that we can do this, and if you notice, it starts to redeposit on different areas, and I'm going to show you that on a new sheet of foundations paper. So I can take what's left now that I've lifted off of my stencil, or with my stencil brush, and deposit it as a really light watercolor, so I'm not wasting. Look how pretty this is. Isn't that pretty? And my stencil was wet, so that went on there. But isn't that beautiful? So there's another way I can use the watercolor markers, and I'm going to show you another technique using them. So because the watercolor markers are a pure pigment, another great thing we can do is make our own colored mist. So I just have a water mister filled with water, and then I can just go in here and squeeze a couple of drops of pigment. So you want to use the darker of the watercolor markers so that you get a nice color load, right? So the less water you use, the more pigment, the darker this will be. But when I shake this up, I can start to make my own mist. So I'm using a sheet of watercolor, and let's just put a stencil down, and I can show you how pretty this is. So I don't have a ton of pigment in here. It's just going to be a really nice soft effect. But I love it. Look at that. Isn't that beautiful? So again, same product, but we can do multiple things. And we don't want to waste what's on here. So I have this leftover piece of foundations paper, and then I can just go on here and stamp with the stencil. So whatever's left on there, I get that pretty positive and negative effect using the watercolor markers. So Vicki Boutin Watercolor Markers, aren't they a ton of fun? Here are, grabbing them again, the markers. This is what the package looks like. If you already have it and didn't even realize that you had all this magic in a little box, these are the techniques you can do with them. This is just showing them right out of the brush pen and coloring on and then adding a little bit of water. So that's one way to use them. We did the kissing technique that I then did a bunch of stuff on here. So out of the marker, kissing technique, painting stamps, watermarking, because they're very water reactive. Then we lifted some of the color using a stencil and a stencil brush, because you can do a reverse removal instead of adding the color. We also could go through and use them with the stencil brush, and then we can make a mist and mist through a stencil and do stencil kissing. That's at least 5 different ways that you can use these. Just the basics of using these watercolor markers, and then just keep watching for it. There are going to be tons of videos where I add on to this and show you lots of fun ways to use them on their own or with other products. So I can't wait to share, and I can't wait to see what you guys are making with the watercolor markers. So what do you think? That was a lot of fun. I love the watercolor markers. I love that you get a whole different effect using them as compared to other pigment-based products. The dye in the watercolor markers creates amazing effects. I can't wait to see what you guys are creating with them. Make sure you're sharing. If you have any questions, post them in the comments below, and get ready for the next one. Tomorrow we're going to be using one of my favorite products in the next video in the series. So thanks for joining me, and I can't wait to see what you're making with Vicki Boutin Watercolor Markers.